Would you describe it as an organized insurrection, or was this more of a spontaneous riot that spun out of control?
Honestly, I couldn't label it either of those ways. It could be argued that Trump is saying this stuff and it is whipping them into a frenzy. On the other hand, it could be argued that they would be this mad regardless of what words he used. Clearly, they didn't listen to him or appreciate him saying peacefully and patriotically. It's like if you look at the right, then well over half of those people believe that the election was stolen last time and could be again. And then if you look at the left, they believe that there was a serious attempt to basically commit a coup. Right, you have a unprecedented lack of faith in democracy going into this next election.
This is Just Asking Questions, a show for inquiring minds on Reason.
Who's most to blame for the storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2021? And how much does it matter to the election in November 2024? Just Asking Questions. I'm Zach Weissmuller, senior producer for Reason. I'm joined by my co-host, Liz Wolfe, Reason Associate Editor and author of the daily Reason Roundup. Hey, Liz.
Hey, Zach.
We all remember the events of January 6th, which resulted in unforgettable images like this, an evacuation of the Capitol, several deaths, and $2.7 billion in costs, all told when you factor in property damage, security, and the subsequent investigations, according to the Government Accountability Office estimates. More than 1,200 criminal charges and impeachment, and decades in prison for many participants in the riots. Today's guest was there during the lead-up to J6. Not as a participant, but as a chronicler. Ford Fischer is a documentary filmmaker and editor-in-chief of News to Share, which is on the scene for seemingly every major act of political unrest in this country. Ford was also once upon a time an intern at Reason, and most recently, he was a co-writer and cinematographer on a new documentary about January 6th called Fight Like Hell, directed by Jon Long and now available for free on YouTube. Ford, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So there are several documentaries at this point about this event out there, but this one contains some footage that is unique that you captured in the days leading up to the Capitol riot, which I think helps the viewer understand better the mechanics of this movement and sort of what unfolded step by step leading up to it. Some important context. What did you see during this time embedded with the Stop the Steal movement that's been underreported or underappreciated by the public?
Yeah, absolutely. So there have been so many documentaries, like you said, kind of about January 6th. And I think that a failure of both the mainstream media in general, as well as documentarians who have covered it retroactively, has been that they're so focused on Trump and what Trump was doing during that time, which is, to be sure, important history, but that they really ignored what was going on the ground leading up until then. So I was there at the very first Stop the Steal rally, which was November 5th. Of 2020. So not 48 hours after the election was over, still 2 days until the outcome was sort of officially determined. That was November 7th that sort of Fox News made the call that Joe Biden had officially reached the number of electoral college votes, that he was certainly the winner. On November 5th, there was Ed Martin, who was a former state chair of, I believe it was the Missouri Republican Party, led this very small rally, just a couple dozen people in front of the Republican National Committee here in Washington, D.C., and, alleged that the election was being stolen in real time. And so, as I'm sure we're going to talk about more, I kind of watched it grow, this movement from that moment where you had just a couple dozen people through to these state rallies all across the country, to the first and second Million MAGA marches, which drew tens of thousands of people to Washington, D.C., to, of course, kind of the third of those gigantic pro-Trump rallies, which was January 6th. But I think that if you ask the average American, they might not even be aware that January 6th was the third such event in Washington, D.C. If you were to kind of just watch the mainstream media's telling of it, they kind of make it look like this chronicle of, oh, on December 19th, Trump tweeted, "Be there, we'll be wild." And then they showed up and then they rioted. And that, like, end of story. And I guess the point of this film is to show there was a lot more to it.
I really enjoyed the documentary, though I'm not sure enjoyed is exactly the right word. I thought it was great because it didn't do too much editorializing. It presented footage and allowed the sort of gravity of it to help viewers make their own sort of conclusions and form their own conclusions, which, I mean, so frequently there's very heavy-handed editorializing that comes from any journalistic output, anything related to Trump, let alone January 6th. So props on that front. But one of the things that I thought was interesting in particular was the degree to which you guys focused on Ali Alexander. Can you explain to our viewers, who is he and what did he do here?
Right. So Ali Alexander was the co-founder of the Stop the Steal movement in 2020. So he kind of explains, as you pointed out, we try not to editorialize. So we really showed the words of the people who were involved kind of in real time. So in Ali Alexander's own words, he described himself as kind of the father of Stop the Steal, whereas he described Roger Stone as kind of the godfather of Stop the Steal. And although we didn't go too much into things that happened kind of before the events of the election and leading up to January 6th, Roger Stone had coined that term at earlier times, sort of with the idea, for example, that he would have launched a Stop the Steal movement if Trump had lost in 2016. And of course, Trump ended up winning. So that ended up being, in a way, irrelevant. But so when Stop the Steal was relaunched, it was with Ali Alexander as its co-founder. So Ali organized those events on the ground, right? He's promoting the state rallies. He's at a lot of the individual events. He was actually the permit holder for the element of the rally that would have taken place at the East Lawn of the United States Capitol had it not devolved into a riot. So, of course, there was the Trump speech and all of the various speeches that happened on the morning of January 6th. And there was also all of the speeches that took place at Freedom Plaza on January 5th. Had January 6th not devolved into a riot, in theory, there would have been a rally on the east side of the Capitol that the march would have gone to, and Ali Alexander was the permit holder for that. But so he sort of takes credit for a lot of elements of what took place both on the ground, as well as concepts like the alternative electors theory. This was an idea that was kind of happening in November. And then, of course, their hope was to sort of defeat it in the courts. And as you saw, the second Million MAGA March was kind of aligned with the moment that the Supreme Court said, no, we're not taking this 8-1. And then, of course, it became the vice president was the focus of President Trump on the day of January 6th. But Ali had been involved as a co-founder, involved in the strategizing, and, of course, the organizing the coalition on the ground that all kind of culminated in that one big day.
Can you explain the alternate electors theory just really quickly in case somebody's not as steeped in this knowledge as you are?
For sure. So again, because the film focuses more on the political activism, I will say that you only tangentially see this when you watch Fight Like Hell. But there was this kind of idea that because the way that the election works, you're electing electors who then represent the will of the people in the electoral college. But this is why the count is 270 rather than, a popular vote of the United States. And so there was this idea presented in a couple of states where it was hypothesized that if you sent Republican electors, even if the popular vote had gone or been counted to the Democrats, that you could end up with competing electors or have some kind of overriding electors when you get to January 6th. And so their hope on the Trump supporters' end was that, if Arizona sends Republican electors, even though Arizona was won by the Democrats, then in Congress you could have either the vice president choose to count the Republican ones or say, I don't know what to do, and then not count them at all and delay it more. So there were a combination of kind of rivaling and converging theories, but all based around the idea of basically stopping 270 from being certified on J6.
I've got another question about Ali Alexander because he features heavily in the beginning of the documentary. You've got a lot of footage of him. I want to roll a little bit of that footage of him describing his own role within this movement, and then ask you a follow-up. Go ahead and roll that, Jon.
Who here knows who created Stop the Steal in 2020? Yeah, that would be me. Now, where does that phrase come from, though? That phrase comes from my good friend, Roger Stone. So, Roger Stone is very much the godfather of Stop the Steal. And I am very much the father of Stop the Steal.
Okay, so he's the father, and Roger Stone's the godfather. This is I feel bad for this child, but how much Stone is sort of on the periphery of, he was directly associated with the Trump campaign for a short time. They then distanced themselves from him. He then got convicted of a crime and was pardoned by Donald Trump. So that's a pretty close connection directly to the Trump campaign. How much coordination did you observe between someone like Ali Alexander and GOP officials or people within the Trump campaign? Or was he just really a sort of rogue actor?
So I think that there's actually a really informative little bit if you watch closely in the film, which is that Ali actually describes that the part of the purpose of the Stop the Steal website. So very early on, he launches stopthesteal.us, and it's telling people where to organize for all of the rallies that you see. And again, of course, this being a very raw footage presentation, things like Ali's texts to the presidential campaign and so forth, you wouldn't see as much in an observational film like this. But one thing that he actually describes, because we do show the periscopes, we show what Ali is saying in real time, is that you can use that website to report sort of your own observation or evidence of the voter fraud that he's alleging. And so he actually describes that we're getting those straight to the Trump campaign. And so during the press conference that you see at the RNC, so this ends up kind of being a headquarters, if you will, and I guess it goes to your question, of a lot of these events, right? The very first Stop the Steal event takes place right outside the RNC, featuring a former state Republican chair, and promoted and put on by Ali, although Ali wasn't physically present at that one. But then at that same building inside of it is where Rudy Giuliani gave kind of the infamous press conference. Much was made about kind of his hair dye that was melting because of his forehead getting a little bit sweaty. But it was hot in there, to be fair. It was very warm inside, so I can't blame him on that particular point. But what Rudy presents is he goes, we have tons of evidence, and it's the affidavits. And so those affidavits, although he didn't end up, it's not like he handed them out, but those affidavits were essentially collected by the public, and Ali was directly promoting the public to do that. So he is coordinating with Rudy, who is Trump's personal lawyer at the time. Yeah. And that effort is being made both for the sake of the courts and then sort of the streets.
One random question that just I can't get out of my mind, and maybe you know the answer, Ford. How does Ali make money? Or does he have a day job? Is this his day job? He's not a political figure who before all of this I'd really heard of. What exactly does he do?
Yeah, so I had covered him a little bit as a Republican political operative before. Kind of in 2019, I had covered a couple of things that he had done, both sort of rallies as well as attempting to kind of create hit pieces or smear campaigns against, for example, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. To be honest, I'm not...
you don't really need to work very hard to create a smear campaign against Ilhan Omar, right? You sort of get handed material all the time. She makes it easy on everyone.
I'm not going to even venture into what he claimed about her, but you can find that on your own if you wish to. I do not know the extent to which he was funded by anything other than kind of people. I will say that during that time period, although again this isn't an emphasis of the film, this isn't a big element of the film, but he does in his periscopes, which we've reviewed, basically hundreds of hours of what he's saying during that time period. There was a lot of fundraising going on. I mean, he was telling people to basically donate to him to keep these events going. And I really have no way to know to what extent he was able to kind of pocket that versus put those expenses into stopping the steal. But I think that that's an interesting question for sure.
Well, one more interesting aspect of the Ali Alexander portion of this story to me is the fact that he never went to prison. He was never convicted of anything. There were stories published about how he very willingly cooperated with the DOJ's January 6th inquiry. There's other of these sort of high-profile influencers who are in the documentary, people like Nick Fuentes, also, as far as I know, not ever charged with anything. So there's a sort of strange, like, these people with these megaphones getting a crowd whipped up to the point that they're committing crimes and ending up in prison, and then singing like a canary and skating free. Did that outcome surprise you at all?
To be honest, it didn't surprise me all that much. I think that kind of what did surprise me in terms of the outcome of everything was the way in which there were some people in those kinds of leadership positions who didn't physically participate, who did still get held legally responsible. And so the examples I would cite are, again, this isn't as covered in the film specifically because it was very focused on like the organic movement. So I want to proceed this by saying out of the January 6 defendants, less than 10% were part of an organized group such as the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys. And so this film really is a look at kind of what would somebody, just a normal person participating in the Stop the Steal movement and then January 6th see essentially through the front lines. And so it doesn't overly focus on Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. And there are other films that have kind of attempted to do that. But with that being said, to sort of get to your question, I saw Stuart Rhodes that day. I photographed him near the East Steps. And Stuart Rhodes didn't physically participate basically in anything. To those who don't know,
for our audience, that's the founder of the Oath Keepers. Not the founder, but the leader of the Oath Keepers.
Right. And so he was physically at January 6th, but didn't physically participate in the violence. And he was not arrested for about a year after the events at the Capitol, whereas the Oath Keepers stack, who kind of went in, at his behest, we kind of later learned because of his text messages, they were all arrested very promptly. And so Rhodes ultimately was convicted of seditious conspiracy and sentenced to 18 years in prison. And basically the legal reasoning was that he had, according to the texts, instructed specific people to go in kind of in a specific manner. You go in a stack here, group two, go in a stack here. And that the Oath Keepers had amassed dozens of firearms across the river in Virginia. I was a little bit surprised, I guess, that he did end up being charged, given that they had waited so long to do that. And by the same token, I actually also filmed as Enrique Tarrio got out of jail. He had served a 4-month sentence. A 5-month sentence, but he served 4 months out of it in Washington, D.C. on a misdemeanor for burning or for essentially instructing the Proud Boys to burn a Black Lives Matter banner that was taken from a church at the 2nd Million MAGA March. When he got out of jail, it was right after Stuart Rhodes had been charged with seditious conspiracy. And I actually asked him, Stuart Rhodes was just charged with seditious conspiracy. Are you concerned that you're next? And he said no, that he was absolutely innocent and that he did not anticipate being charged. It's the last time I ever spoke to him. Because indeed he was arrested and is now serving a 22-year sentence. He's the only January 6ther whose sentencing release date is all the way in the decade of 2040. Enrique Tarrio was not there at the Capitol. Tarrio was actually in Baltimore at the time because of that previous arrest. He had basically been banned on January 5th from being in D.C. pending his charges. And so for that reason, he wasn't there, which left Joe Biggs, who you do see in the film. You see Joe Biggs marching the folks over to the front line, was kind of the highest ranking Proud Boy who was physically there. Tarrio was ultimately charged along with the others for seditious conspiracy on the basis of kind of that text leadership.
Yeah, it kind of gets to the question of how to describe what happened, because the fact that the heaviest charges were laid upon people who didn't actually go into the Capitol, didn't destroy property or hurt anybody, but were perceived as the planners or the architects to some degree, that plays into the notion that this was an insurrection, and that's why they're being charged with sedition. So some people will describe this as an insurrection. Some people will describe it as a riot. There's a whole spectrum probably in between that. And I thought Jacob Sullum, one of our writers, covered this at the time, and kind of got to the question with this headline: do these seditious conspiracy convictions prove the Capitol riot was not spontaneous? And he writes that convicting the former Proud Boys leader, Tario, who you just outlined his story, who did not participate in the riot or attend the rally that preceded it, of seditious conspiracy, he describes it as an inherently amorphous term that could apply to any protest that includes violence if the government alleges that the organizers intended that result and aimed to interfere with the execution of any law of the United States. And that leaves prosecutors with broad discretion that invites politically motivated charges. So that is one possibly concerning outcome of this from a civil liberties standpoint, even if you're on this, you agree that people who break things in the Capitol should face some sort of punishment. This sort of capacious, seditious conspiracy charge has its own set of red flags associated with it. But I guess I'm curious to get your perspective as someone who was with these people for up to the moment when they walked up to those Capitol steps. Would you describe it as an organized insurrection, or was this more of a spontaneous riot that spun out of control?
Honestly, I couldn't label it either of those ways.
Okay.
So I think that, as you see in the film, spontaneous is certainly not a word that I would use to describe it. I mean, I do think that there was a buildup over a sustained period of time. And particularly given the violence that happened on the night of January 5th, which again, I don't think that most Americans are basically aware that that happened. I think that it was pretty surprising how ill prepared the Capitol Police were for it. And there are some people who take that and put it in sort of a conspiratorial direction. I hear people kind of responding to my tweets all the time by saying like, oh, they let it happen, or like they wanted it to happen, or it was entrapment, or something like that. I think it's more like, to me,
it's what's more incompetence than malice. This is a thing that libertarians spar over all the time, like government malice or government incompetence. And you're saying with the Capitol Police security failures, you're on the incompetent side?
Yeah, and part of the reason that I can say that is that, having seen the front lines of January 6th with my own eyes, I felt very strongly that the individual officers who I watched were kind of giving it their all, so to speak. Like, I've seen sometimes people online use, clips that appear to show a cop like waving someone in or something like that, and pretty much every time I've seen that very clearly debunked. And so, just to anyone who might be watching this, who sort of has that in their head, what I would just say is, for example, something that happened was that once lines had been breached around the wider perimeter of the Capitol, there was a moment in which police basically retreated to hold the building rather than to hold the grounds. And so there were moments where it almost just looked like police were almost like derelict in their duty, where if you were just watching and you didn't understand the broader context of what had happened, that the line had been broken, it would sort of look like the police just turned around and left. And in some cases, the police were literally waving their own officers like, we all have to retreat. And the way that those clips were used was to make it look like the cops are waving in the Trump supporters. In fact, though, what I saw was police kind of fighting sort of as strongly as they could. In that exact moment, I remember my own angle of that was on the west front of the Capitol, and I saw, Trump supporters charge up the stairs as police had their backs to them running away. And I do remember myself in that moment feeling kind of confused, like how could they abandon this post? What I learned later from the radio traffic that actually New York Times had published was that this was a moment that the line had been broken. So in effect, if they hadn't pulled back, they would have been flanked in a matter of minutes, and so their position wouldn't have mattered. That was all just sort of an aside to say, to me, I anticipated it. I brought a gas mask, I brought goggles, and that was based on having been on the ground at all of these things, seeing the escalating sort of tension and violence. I didn't know exactly how it was going to go. I actually remember talking to other reporters on the day before, and sort of what I had predicted was that, kind of like the previous 2 million MAGA marches, I kind of thought the Trump supporters were going to go ballistic at night. I thought that the thing would get certified and then they would react. So in a sense, it kind of jumped the gun of what I thought would happen as I was there on the ground. But I think it was entirely anticipatable. And so the word spontaneous would certainly not describe it. However, I think the other end of your question was, you said, was it a spontaneous riot or an organized insurrection? The way that the riot actually played out was anything but organized, right? So you might have these individual little sects that can be described as organized, such as, again, the Oath Keepers, who had, an actual kind of military formation in a couple of cases, that had guns across the river that, that they would bring in if certain circumstances were met. Those were organized bits. The Proud Boys were quasi-organized, at least they had a hierarchical group. You had Enrique Tarrio texting them, "Don't effing leave," right? You could kind of call that a command structure, but a little bit more sloppy. But again, in excess of 90% of the people who participated in the violence, let alone the entire crowd, but were not members of organized groups. And those people, I think it really was just crowd mentality. And I've seen that kind of riot that kind of riot mentality at all sorts of other riots over the past many years. So I think it would be fair to say there were organized elements, but not everyone was part of some kind of an organized conspiracy.
Given these militias that were present, I have kind of a fucked up question, but I do feel like asking it because why not? We have you here. Why didn't it turn more violent, right? Like, you have a bunch of people with significant manpower, and you're talking about the organization of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, and you're mentioning, the Oath Keepers were prepared to bring a whole bunch more weapons in if certain conditions were met. A, what were those conditions? And B, like, if they actually believe the things that they were saying, which is that this is the American Revolution round 2. We are here because we have a tyrannical government and, we are having this vote be stolen from us. If they actually believe that deeply, and there was a lot of bluster about, wanting to lay down your life for this cause. And obviously we have the tragic death of Ashley Babbitt, but I'm a little bit surprised that I don't know, I remember watching the footage on that day and thinking, oh God, surely this will end in mass bloodshed. And it didn't. Yeah. And so do you have theories?
We have a clip of one of these militia members you're talking about, Liz. Let's so we can hear them in their own words. And then I'd love to hear you address Liz's question. Let's roll that clip of some of the rhetoric that was being put out by some of these militia groups that were on the outskirts of the protest.
We are at war. The situation we're in is a situation of treason. There's only one punishment for treason in our Constitution. One. The punishment for treason is death.
The president met with Michael Flynn, former national security advisor, who was pardoned by the president despite having pled guilty to counts of lying to the FBI. They apparently discussed this idea about using martial law to rerun the 2020 presidential election.
The fraud that is being perpetrated on the United States of America through this previous election is outrageous. We will decide who the next president of the United States is going to be. And we did decide.
Yeah, I mean, when I hear this type of super hot rhetoric, it's shocking to me that this didn't end in way more bloodshed. Do you have theories, being on the ground and knowing a lot of these people, interviewing them, as to why that is?
Yeah, so I've actually interviewed Eric Braden is the name of the guy with the Texas Star hat there from the Southern Patriot Council. So that scene that you saw was December 12th in Atlanta, Georgia. And so it's important to remember the context at that time period was Georgia was one of the places that Trump was especially focused on, as this is where the steal is taking place. And so that was outside the Georgia state capitol a month before. And I think it goes to the same point of like, how did the FBI, police, et cetera, not see this coming at the United States Capitol when all of this was going to converge in one place, a month later? As it relates to the Oath Keepers in particular, who I would say are probably similar in philosophy, but again, we're actually in Washington, D.C. Just to be very clear, Eric Braden personally was not in D.C. On the day of January 6th. And I've interviewed him actually about it. But he was subpoenaed by the January 6th committee, but then ended up not actually testifying. In any event, what Stewart Rhodes described in his trial was that he basically did have the guns in Virginia. And to be very clear, there's nothing illegal about having 100 guns in a hotel room in Virginia on its own.
I aim to do that at least once a year,
Right.
Not to overthrow the government, but just like for a good time, right?
You've got 50 guns in a hotel room in Virginia. The thing you should be thinking to yourself might be, do I need 50 more? No. Okay. So what Stewart Rhodes described was that so they were specifically left in a place that would ostensibly be legal to have them. And so the question was, as you pointed out, what would it take for him to have brought them? And I want to be clear, it would be a horrifying situation. We'd practically be in another country right now. If 100 rifles had made their way to January 6th, a lot of different outcomes could happen. And I don't think any of them would be good. But Rhodes said that the two conditions that would have caused him to essentially order his guys to take the firearms into DC would be if there was an imminent threat from what he regarded as basically Antifa or the left. And so during that time period, a lot of the organizing, and I think this leads all the way up to January 6th, a lot of the organizing and a lot of the reason that Trump supporters were bringing weapons to these events was actually because they were anticipating facing off with the Antifa movement. And so there were left-wing groups who were counter-protesting them at a lot of these things. That happened at the first Million MAGA March, at the second Million MAGA March, and kind of across the country. There was actually armed Antifa groups in Georgia who were countering those armed groups you just showed the clip of. So a lot of their organizing was based on the idea that they would end up street fighting their political rivals, as opposed to the police. The other situation that he said would cause him, other than sort of direct self-defense against sort of the Antifa, which of course did not happen. There was not an organized anti-fascist rally on January 6th. The other...
Why do you think that is, by the way?
Yeah, so I've actually talked to some of the DC kind of Antifa organizers, and basically their feeling was this isn't our fight by that point. There had been relatively small groups of Antifa people who went on the November and December Million MAGA marches, and they were pretty severely outnumbered. And in particular on the evenings of those dates, the Proud Boys were basically roving around the city trying to get to them and assault them. And the optics, which ended up being rather bizarre, was that the police were basically protecting the Antifa people from the Proud Boys. I actually filmed Jeremy Bertino, who ended up being one of the first to plead guilty to seditious conspiracy. This was an early Proud Boy guilty plea. He yelled at the police, "Just give us 1 hour. We'll clean up this city forever." Right? Like they were pissed that the police were kind of protecting the other side. And again, that was a lot of what the antagonism and organization was kind of based around from a tactical or kind of violence perspective. Going back to Rhodes, so that was part of his framing of why he had the firearms in Virginia. The other circumstance he said was that, in his mind, if Trump actually did invoke the Insurrection Act, and this might seem ironic in retrospect because January 6th is widely regarded by the media and so forth as an insurrection, but to the people in that mindset at the time who felt that the election was stolen, they viewed the supposed stealing of the election as itself an insurrection. And so Stewart Rhodes described that if President Trump or somebody kind of in his inner circle had personally authorized the Oath Keepers to go in. I'm invoking the Insurrection Act. I need the help of what Stuart Rhodes regarded as the unorganized militia, essentially meaning normal people that would be like deputized to enforce Trump's will. Then he would go in. Essentially, he was waiting for presidential authority. And he believed that he never got that, and so that never happened. The thing that I would point out about how close we were to that scenario is that, in retrospect, many January 6th defendants have said that they did whatever it was that they did because they believed that President Trump was telling them to, right? We fight like hell because if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. That's a really big statement to say. And to be fair, he did say peacefully and patriotically early in the speech. And so you see all of those things and you can judge them for yourself watching Fight Like Hell on YouTube. But if Stuart Rhodes had felt that some communication he received from the White House or something that Trump said crossed that line or was enough to make him feel deputized in that manner, then that could have happened. And so, again, it did not, and there was not a shootout at the United States Capitol. But I think it was a little bit closer than history seems to realize.
Well, but even just considering, I mean, all of that makes a lot of sense. And thinking about this alternative version of history, if some of those conditions had been satisfied that could have altered Rhodes's behavior, I think that's very interesting. But one of the things that, does stay on my mind is this sense of like, once they actually breached the Capitol, there was a lot of QAnon shaman like goofing off and doing dumb shit, right? But to me, that and not that he's the only one, but I'm just thinking about the imagery, like the visuals of the stupid things he did, and lots of his ilk, and there was lots of like antagonism directed toward Nancy Pelosi. But I'm sorry, but like if you actually believe that something so horrible, that the stealing of the election was itself an insurrection, consider me unimpressed, right, by your conduct, right? You're getting there and it's almost like you kind of are like shocked that you're in this position. It strikes me as unserious people who don't actually seriously believe the thing that they claim to. What do you make of that? Do you think I'm being, terribly uncharitable here? How does this comport with what you've experienced interviewing these people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it goes to exactly like what we were saying about, on the one hand, it might not have been spontaneous for all the reasons described, but on the other hand, that doesn't mean that it was organized, right? So when you get to, having the Q shaman sitting in the vice president's chair, you heard one person in the Senate chamber actually joke. He said, "I guess we should form a new government now." Right. But like, if anyone
literally, that's the whole point, right? Like, that is what you guys claim to believe. So excuse me for taking you at your word, right?
The Q shaman is going to establish Robert's rules for order and smash the gavel. And I'm the vice president now. And no, of course
he's
not.
He's literally not wearing a shirt as he's, purporting to start a new government. Like, what?
Right.
Seriously?
Right. Of course. Right. So again, it would have been a lot more people hurt, of if it had gone kind of the alternative history way kind of being described. But no, I mean, in that sense, like the Q shaman wasn't going to establish a government. There was a guy sitting in front of the the podium there who had like his like a hole blown out in his cheek from like a rubber bullet or something, right? The people who actually made it that far, I don't know what they thought that they would have done. But I also don't think that that's in general the mentality of sort of rioters on the whole, right? I've been at, for example, I would say like Black Lives Matter and Antifa, anti-fascist kind of rallies. And like similarly, even if they got to the sort of end state of their rallies, for example, in Portland attacking a courthouse, right? Like at night, even if you broke into the courthouse and then, had people sitting there, like, are you going to establish court? Are you a federal judge now because you made it there? Like, of course not. So I mean, I think that element of it probably gets to, like you said, more of a riot or more of a disorganized thing as opposed to some kind of an organized conspiracy.
I think that's very true.
You did a nice job explaining earlier how the illusion of the DC, the Capitol Police welcoming the protesters in was not what it appears from these clips. Another clip that is circulated sort of most prominently by Tucker Carlson was the security footage of the QAnon shaman being seemingly like just led right into the chambers for this LARPy photo opportunity. Do you have any theory as to what is going on there? Because that's also aroused suspicion for people who are like, why was he even able to sort of just like waltz in there like that?
Yeah, I mean, I did personally witness a degree of gentleness in some cases, and then I've seen a lot of videos that kind of recount similar scenes where when the police are pretty overwhelmed, they're kind of being like unduly cordial to those people. I would love to see audio of like what the officers were saying to the Q shaman as they were escorting him around, because that's true. I mean, those images were bizarre. But I think that it's also noteworthy, like when someone like Tucker shows that footage, I think that something that is often missed is that once police were actually able to form a presence inside of the Senate chamber where he was, they pushed them out very much forcefully. When they had one officer in the chamber, essentially who had been involved with escorting him into there, he was being sort of ridiculously polite to them, given the context of it. The officer says, like, is there any, this is like actual quote. I've seen this clip so many times. I have it in my head. He says, is there any chance I could get you guys to leave the chamber? This is like the most sacred place,
right,
is the way that he phrases it. And of course, once more officers arrive, and there's body camera footage of this as well, but I don't think that it's as emphasized by, an outlet like Tucker Carlson or whatever, that they push them out very forcefully. So
right. Just a numbers game. Yeah.
I think it's a numbers game, and there was definitely a degree of gentleness when officers were just completely overwhelmed.
And then, if I had to summarize what I hear you saying about the Stewart Rhodes and militia situation, is they were sort of, standing back and standing by as as instructed, and the call to action never really came. And so I think all of us on this stream can acknowledge, Trump never, issued some commands to go and storm the Capitol, but he was impeached for for basically inciting this action with his speech. That's the allegation. And I know you were there for the entire Trump speech on January 6th. I'd like to roll a little bit of that speech and just get some of your impressions, what it was like being in that crowd, sort of what the vibe was like. But let's hear a little bit of the speech to refresh our memories as to how this all unfolded. This is from the documentary.
That election, our election, was over at 10 o'clock in the evening. We're leading Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, by hundreds of thousands of votes. And then late in the evening or early in the morning, boom, these explosions of bullshit. Here we'll soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. Today we will see whether Republicans stand strong for integrity of our elections. The Constitution says you have to protect our country and you have to protect our Constitution. And you can't vote on fraud. When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules. So I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do. And I hope he doesn't listen to the rhinos and the stupid people that he's listening to.
So what was it like being in that crowd? There had already been a group breaching the Capitol in the middle of that speech, but then kind of added on top of that. Was Trump adding fuel to the fire? What was the vibe like?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it's, in fairness, I don't think that there's any indication that Trump knew that the Capitol had been breached as he's talking. And nor did I, actually. I mean, I learned upon physically arriving there kind of with the front of the crowd. So to kind of place it just as a timeline perspective, as far as like my own videography of it. So I was at the full 70-minute Trump speech, which Trump was supposed to speak at 11. He ends up speaking at noon, right? That's typical Trump, just to be clear. If anybody's ever been to a Trump rally or a conference or something that Trump's speaking at, him being late's pretty normal. So he starts at noon. He ends at 1:10. The breach had already occurred by then. And so there was a much bigger group of people that begin marching because Trump says, and now we're going to march to the Capitol and I'll be there with you and all that stuff. And So I end up filming the people who go to the Capitol, and then I see kind of what those first people who went from the Trump speech to the Capitol would see, and the violence continues. During the Trump speech, firstly, I would just say there was thousands and thousands of people. I mean, it was really an enormous event, and the scale of that, I think, should be pointed out, where even conservatively, it is estimated that 120,000 people were in Washington, D.C. to attend January 6th. And even the most liberal estimate by the DOJ is that about 3,000 people will be charged. So whether it's violence or going in, still a single-digit % of actual people who went to January 6th were participating in this stuff. And I do think that bears some level of history, right? Not everybody who went to January 6th was participating in this way. So when I was at the Trump speech, I'm filming from closer to the Washington Monument. So there was an area that you would have to go through metal detectors and so forth to go inside, that's right up to Trump. But then there were these giant screens kind of at the back of that, so that the much larger crowd who doesn't go through the metal detectors, can watch the speech and then immediately begin marching without going through any kind of security or anything like that. Trump isn't necessarily able to see or hear those people directly. Of course, they're watching him, and then I'm seeing the chants and kind of the reactions that they're making in real time. And I remember that something that I found really interesting was that there was one moment in which he said that basically the elections were as bad as third world nations, or as undependable. I forget the exact phraseology that he employed, but there were people around me who, in reaction to him comparing the elections to third world countries, started chanting, "Fight for Trump, fight for Trump." Right. And so that kind of cuts both ways in terms of people could make arguments about Trump's culpability. On the one hand, it could be argued that Trump is saying this stuff and it is whipping them into a frenzy. On the other hand, it could be argued that they would be this mad regardless of what words he used. Clearly, they didn't listen to him or appreciate him saying peacefully and patriotically, right? So I try to avoid myself attempting to analyze what went on in the brain of Donald Trump, like what were exactly his intentions, what was he hoping would happen. I think that it might be a fool's errand to try to dissect the mind of the former president. And same with legal culpability. I mean, I think that to the extent that he was charged both with inciting insurrection from a congressional standpoint, and now he's also charged by Jack Smith, I wouldn't attempt to kind of like delve into analysis of his own kind of legal culpability, but it's definitely extraordinary to see somebody be prosecuted for words like that. It's a hard hurdle to pass.
Although I think we can infer some things from his actions or lack of actions, which is underlined in your movie, because as this is going on and on, you show the text messages that are coming in from people like Laura Ingraham and Donald Trump Jr. being like, can he please just like say something to calm this down? And I think for a lot of Americans, including myself, it was the lack of weighing in, the lack of saying anything that was the alarming and possibly just like ultimately disqualifying thing for him as a political candidate going forward. It really conveys the impression that there's at least some part of you that is happy that this is happening right now, if you're choosing to kind of hold back at this exact moment.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that when he tweeted that's right after 6 p.m., there was a tweet that he made. So, of course, there was kind of the infamous, like the Rose Garden video was at about 4:30, if I remember. But there was a tweet that he wrote in text form where he said, like, go home in peace and remember this day forever. I think that Trump is very transactional in a way, right? He really cares about people who really care about him. And I think that his initial impression, both from the video and the tweet, in the Rose Garden, he's saying, go home in peace, but you're very special. He tells them you're very special. And he tells them that you've seen how basically you've been wronged. You see how others are treated was a line that he used. Like he validates their grievances a lot while telling them to leave and saying you're very special. And at 6 p.m., telling them similarly, remember this day forever. It felt to me like, although it was certainly politically expedient and tactically expedient for him to have, probably legally expedient in the long run, for him to tell them to leave and be peaceful and so forth. I think that there was some sense of pride that seemed to be transmitted in that first day at the fact that people love him enough to do this, right? That thousands of people would fight like this for you. It's a very Trumpian mentality, perhaps, to view that as something to be proud of. But it seemed to me in those initial communications that he did feel some degree of pride. That stood in stark contrast to on January 7th, when he releases a video saying that basically, if you committed violence, you're going to be held accountable and so forth. And it seemed like he had maybe a really strong talking to by many people, but at least what he was expressing seemed to be a very severe change of tone and change of mind by the following day. And it's been interesting because for a while he did not want to talk about January 6th, right? I've been kind of following the movement of people who call January 6th prisoners POWs and so forth. There's a vigil that takes place outside the DC jail every night for people who are still incarcerated for January 6th. And Trump has, for a while, was really kind of ignoring that community. And then starting about a year afterwards, he did start leaning into them, where he would occasionally call into their events, where he has called his own supporters political prisoners. He started using their language, referring to the DC jail as the gulag. And so there is sort of a revision of his tone that's taking place now about what had happened on January 6th.
To sort of, I guess, steelman that perspective, their belief is that this was more or less a setup, that this was allowed to happen in order to make Trump bad. In fact, there's a really interesting moment in the documentary where you just hear the voice of Sean Spicer, his former spokesperson, saying, like, man, if they had just stayed back, they could have actually had the debate that they wanted to in the Senate. And that all got, that the kibosh was put on that by this action. And so that's the argument I hear a lot from that camp, is that it was an intention. It was sort of intentionally allowed to happen. There were even, possibly people embedded in the crowd stoking this towards happening. The advantage of talking to you is that you were there not only on January 6th, but in the lead up. You were there on January 5th. And I want to roll a clip from the documentary of what was going on January 5th, because there was already some signs of unrest. Could we roll that clip, John?
All hell is going to break loose tomorrow. It's not going to happen like you think it's going to happen. Okay, it's going to be quite extraordinarily different. And all I can say is strap in. You have made this happen, and tomorrow it's game day.
Get the fuck out of here! That's right. And you know what? Your black lives can matter anywhere else.
Move back! Back up! Back him up! Back him up! Move! Use your bicycle! Use your bicycle!
Whoa! Watch it!
So you've got Bannon there saying something's going to happen. You've got people like Alex Jones saying the same thing. You've got this footage we just saw of already the violence is starting to unfold. As someone who's covered a lot of civil strife before, what did you make of that security deficiency on January 6th?
Yeah, so over that time period, I guess you could call it, of kind of November 3rd, the election up to January 6th, there was a real transition that took place. And I don't think that the security state, the police, the FBI seemed to adequately understand it. And so I'll try to explain it. But this is something that a tonal shift even that I kind of witnessed on the ground. over the 4 years leading up to the election, so during the administration of Trump, you had a lot of groups like militias, Proud Boys, and so forth, who were basically Trump aligned and who would often wear like thin blue line. They're expressing admiration for the police. Many times across the country, they're describing themselves kind of as we're here to back up the police, shaking hands and basically fond of law enforcement. And I think that during that time, I would almost describe some of those groups as basically paramilitaries, that they viewed themselves as extensions of the state that's in power, defenders of the then status quo. And when the election happened, and of course there was a defiance among those groups about accepting the results of it, but there was kind of a transition that took place, right? So if you're a group that's aligned with Trump, and Trump is the head of the state, then you kind of feel like the police, the apparatus of the state are on our side. And who are the insurgents, right? Like the insurgents would be people who have been rioting throughout 2020, anti-fascists and so forth. As it became more and more obvious that Trump may lose the seat of power, and I think to most people, it's kind of the election happens and then it's over, right? So once it's declared, I think they kind of, most people in the United States basically thought that's it. But to this movement, to the Stop the Steal movement, which includes these kind of groups that had been aligned with the state before, it sort of feels like losing the grip of power. On December 12th, I actually did personally witness, and you don't see this like line in the film in particular, but I actually saw some arguing between the Trump supporters over how they should view the police who were on the ground there. We were talking earlier about how Trump supporters were basically trying to get to the Antifa counter protesters and police were in the way. And they were saying like the police have lost their way. They're commie cops, which I mean, honestly, commie cops is like a preposterous, thing to hear. But their viewpoint was that the police had changed. What I think was really happening, because I don't think that the police like tactically changed in any way based on Trump having lost the election. What I think was really happening was that there was kind of this transition where these groups that felt aligned with the state were sort of losing that feeling of the grip of power, and that sent them from feeling like they had an allied relationship with the police to an adversarial one. And so they were expressing that they felt like the police had turned on them. In reality, I think it was that their disposition had changed. As far as the day of January 6th, although it's hard to have direct insight into kind of the thinking of law enforcement at the time, I would speculate to some degree that they had felt, based on history, Trump supporters didn't really have a history of fighting with the police. They had a history of fighting with the left, and the left had more of a history of fighting with the police. But as those fights would sort of shake out, you would find the right far more likely to be aligned with the police in the 4 years prior. January 6th was something very different, and I think being on the ground throughout all of that stuff, like that evolution was clear to me, and you see that on the night of January 5th. I think that that's a kind of mini culmination of that exact mentality. I think that if they had been looking at it really closely, they might have thought to themselves essentially, wow, they might turn on us tomorrow. But of course, they were completely unprepared when that ended up happening. But by that time, I think essentially that transition had completed.
I want to bring us back to the question of whether or not there were basically feds in the crowd, and what evidence we have to evaluate that. I think so frequently when you hear people discuss this, they have either, in my view, insufficient evidence, or they have so much sort of alternative source evidence. But I want to take us to the Massie clip really fast. If we could just play that, John, that would be great.
Do you have evidence of the number of confidential human sources that were operating on the Capitol grounds on January 6th?
Our report will include the information in that regard.
We pretty much know there were confidential human sources who went into the Capitol and right there alongside of everybody else. Wouldn't they need to follow DOJ CHS protocols, and do you know if those were followed?
They should follow CHS protocols, and again, we'll include that information in the report.
Do you know how many were reimbursed for travel?
As I sit here, I don't recall the number.
But I don't recall, or you won't tell us?
Well, and if I did know it, I wouldn't be in a position to tell you, because we still have to go through.
We're 4 years into this.
So Thomas Massie was basically questioning the Inspector General, Michael Horowitz. But I think that this is a really interesting question that kind of gets to the heart of a lot of things that I wonder about. And it's especially interesting because we have to consider this in the context, too, of, like, for example, the Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping plot that transpired around roughly the same time period, which understandably, left a lot of people's hackles raised, wondering to what degree are some of these plots cooked up by the feds versus actual legitimate grassroots efforts. So based off of evidence that you have gathered yourself, Ford, do you have a sense of what types of confidential informants or people who have relationships with the government who were embedded there on January 6th? Do you have a sense of the legitimacy of these theories?
Right. So I think that there's a lot of different questions that go into that. And so this is a complicated subject.
Yeah.
And I would love to see an entire film on this subject, honestly.
I want to tread very carefully here and just feel free to caveat as much as possible because it's important to get this right.
Sure. So maybe a first caveat would be to say Fight Like Hell, which you can watch on YouTube for free, is a entirely observational documentary. So to the extent that any person who you might see in it may have some kind of a ulterior motive kind of in their brain, you wouldn't see that. And we're not attempting, there's no narration like this guy might be a Fed or like something like that. You're just seeing what actually happened. And so I would be very interested to see a more investigative piece that attempts to dissect individual people like that if someone thinks that they have the case for it. But so I've watched the way in which after January 6th, there were a lot of attempts to kind of revise or make excuses in some cases for it. And so I do think that context for the Fed claim should be noted with there were other claims first that were kind of made. For example, that Antifa did it. Maybe it was Antifa who stormed the Capitol. They just put on all their Trump hats and then said Trump things and stormed the Capitol, right? That was that position was dissuaded, I think, very quickly, right? There's actually a text by Stuart Rhodes that's kind of funny in hindsight that came out in the trial where somebody texted him like, what if it's Antifa or something like that? And he's like, no, I'm here. This isn't Antifa. This is the Patriots, right? To be clear, that's a paraphrase. It was something like that, but he literally wrote, this isn't Antifa.
Also, I feel like aesthetics can help us out on this. I'm sorry, but having seen the militias and having seen the Antifa, especially I live in New York, so I've seen some of the crazy riots and marches and stuff. I'm sorry, man. We're not talking about similar looking demographic groups here, right? I mean, they're all odious in their own right, but I'm just saying you have a lot of, big burly dudes with weapons and beards in one group, and you don't necessarily have nearly as many of those in the other group, right?
So I'll categorize that as circumstantial evidence. But
I'll be the forensic evaluator for the aesthetics of it all to suss out where it's legit.
So as it relates to I guess CHSs, right? There's a couple of questions in terms of in what way would it matter? And so I think that what they really are getting to the heart of when Thomas Massie is asking about this, and I certainly respect him asking the question. I mean, I think that these are questions that should be asked. But the proposition kind of is if you're talking about responsibility, then you want to know were CHSs egging it on. That's, I think, the more critical question than just were CHSs there. So starting there, when it came to the Whitmer case, for example, there were actual actions taken by CHSs who were in practically the same numbers as normal people, essentially encouraging them to take a certain route that would lead them down a route of kind of criminal conspiracy or the perception thereof. And so when people kind of compare those two different things, the question would be, were there CHSs who were responsible for people's actions on January 6th? That's a different question than just were there CHSs there.
For example, I know you mentioned his name earlier. I'm totally forgetting what it was, but the guy who basically at one point in the documentary says, hey, patriots to the front. We need able-bodied men, everybody to the front, if you're willing to, I'm forgetting his exact wording. But that guy, if that guy were in the position you're describing, okay, that would be relevant and make it more akin to the Whitmer plot. But we don't really necessarily have evidence that he is. And in fact, we have evidence to the contrary that he's a longstanding member of these militias, right?
Okay, so for example, Ryan Samsel is one of the defendants who was kind of like on the front line there, one of the very first people who breaches. Like, he's now been prosecuted right, for doing so. I think that in a lot of these cases, like if a criminal defendant were charged with their actions on January 6th, they could very much raise their hand and basically said, I did it because it was my job as a Fed, right, or whatever. And so there's been this phenomena of, to the extent that people are trying to blame Feds or CHSs and say that that's what was responsible for their actions, which would be a defense if it were true. Those have often ended up being sort of bearing no fruit, right? So I've seen there have been individual defendants who have said, oh, this person is the reason that I went in. You have to identify that person for me because it could be exculpatory evidence. And then that person ends up being arrested. That's happened on a couple of occasions. One of the really big examples was Ray Epps, right? Ray Epps is shown in the documentary. There's footage of him that hasn't been basically published until this doc came out. There were people who basically proposed, like, usually when people said Feds at the Capitol, Ray Epps was the name that would come up all the time. And just to be very clear, Ray Epps was a former state chapter leader of the Oath Keepers. He wasn't an Oath Keeper on the day of January 6th, but he was present on the night of January 5th, and he said, tomorrow we need to go into the Capitol peacefully. And some people on that day said, what? No, Fed, that they felt that he was trying to egg them on to commit some kind of illegal activity. On the day of January 6th, some people have similarly pointed to that Epps, while the crowds are starting to march, he points people toward the Capitol and says, that's where the Capitol is, that's where our problems are. And then he is there present at the moment of the first breach. On the other hand, Epps can be seen trying to tell somebody to not even bring their cane inside because they can shoot you with that in your hand, is what he tells them. Like, he has this sort of like mixed presence of both trying to like push people to go forward to participate, but also like kind of with this veneer of like be peaceful and so forth. But he was interviewed twice by the January 6th committee, who did ask him under oath whether he had any relationship with the government other than his military veteran status, to which he said no. Quite frankly, like, I have not seen any evidence that would suggest that Ray Epps was a CHS or a Fed kind of any kind. I've seen a lot of people hypothesize that sort of based on his behavior, which, to be sure, can be kind of weird and contradictory on the ground, but a lot of people sort of acted that way. A lot of them didn't really view what they were doing necessarily as violence, right? You had thin blue line flags, but you also had fighting of the police. You had Trump saying fight like hell, but also saying peacefully and patriotically. A lot of people were kind of multiple minds. I will say, though, there have been CHSs sort of revealed at trial, and I think that their actual actions so far as presented at trial have not been of the type that can be pointed to and say, this is why January 6th happened. So, for example, as a real example of a CHS, there was a CHS who was among the Proud Boys, right? Who it came out was literally texting his FBI handler on his way marching to the Capitol. I don't remember his name offhand, but he supposedly or apparently, like, his relationship with the FBI was he's talking to them about basically Antifa, right? He's snitching on his enemies, right? And so ergo, he is a CHS, and he was a CHS within the Proud Boys, and he's a CHS within the Proud Boys who stormed the Capitol, right? And so that's an example of one such person. And I would personally be very interested to know about kind of all of those communications, all of what that kind of person did. But I also think that if people are using that only because they want to try to suggest that CHSs were responsible for the storming of the Capitol, I think that that's a much harder case to make.
Yeah, texting an FBI informant to snitch on your opponents is not necessarily like I think that's not necessarily what people are thinking of when they think about that. And so having that detail actually fleshed out, I think that's actually really relevant. I mean, props to Massie for pressing on this. It's a shame that we don't have more, and I'm really curious to see what types of information will come out like a decade from now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, by the same token, there were bombs placed at the RNC and the DNC. We were talking earlier about how, like, the RNC was the beginning of the Stop the Steal movement, was the rally that was right outside of it. The Giuliani press conference happens there. And then on January 5th, someone places bombs that are discovered outside the RNC and the DNC. That person still hasn't been arrested and identified, which is pretty incredible to me. And so similarly, like I've seen it speculated that like, what if that makes that person a Fed? And the honest reality is I have no idea who that person is or what they were sort of about. And kind of to your point, I think that they're really important questions to be asked, but I do think that speculation can kind of run afoul. Like speculation isn't evidence. Lack of knowing isn't evidence that something is what you would want it to be.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right to be demanding that high threshold of evidence, and that's why I so appreciate what Massie is doing there, because all it leaves us with is speculation, and this is just another one of these situations where our government is like decades behind the ball in terms of transparency. I mean, your documentary is just a showcase of the new media world that we're in right now. Like you being there, all these clips instantly going from 1,000 angles of the entire event, the entire thing kind of being spurred by these online influencers. Yet our government, as Massie raises there, 4 years later, as people are trying to weigh how they think about this going into another election involving Donald Trump, we still can't get some pretty basic information, even if I agree with you that I would be quite surprised if the revelation is, it was all sort of orchestrated by insiders. Just given the size of the crowd, seems unlikely, but it's unfortunate that we're left in this information vacuum yet again. As we bring this to a close, I want to ask you, we are in a much different place now than we were in 2020. There's no pandemic. We're not coming off the George Floyd protests of 2020, which I'm sure, played a factor in how people were acting during that time. There's a lot of people in prison. Given that different landscape, what do you think about the likelihood of, J6 Part 2 if Trump loses again, or conversely, something on the other side if Trump wins? You're someone who studies sort of what is going on the streets, what's sort of percolating among these activist groups. Where do you think we are in terms of the likelihood of violence unfolding again?
For sure. So in the very immediate aftermath of the 2020 election, there was actually a quickly formed movement called Count Every Vote. This was almost the diametrical opposite of Stop the Steal, right? The left, who saw Donald Trump at 2 a.m. on election night basically saying, we want all voting to stop. We don't want them finding new ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning, was what Trump said. And so from their perspective, they felt like Trump was about to steal it. He's sitting in the seat of the presidency. He has a considerable degree of power. And so they felt that Trump was going to do that. And there were people arrested in those very first couple days on the left. I think that the way that informs us going into this next election is, particularly if it's a narrow race, I would expect to see protests on the side that is sort of perceived to be losing, especially if there is a serious kind of legal contest, right? It was in 2000 that it did come down to one state, and that ultimately came down to a Supreme Court case that people could have very reasonable disagreements over the outcome over. And so as the next election occurs, I do think that you have a lot of the same grievances among Republicans, right? It's about 70% of Republicans who believe that the election was stolen, and that number has stayed pretty steady, actually, since 2021. And so those people have been prepared to not accept a Trump loss, and I think especially a narrow Trump loss. But similarly, I mean, I think that from the perspective of what I'll call the broader left, there's a perception that Trump is someone who incited an insurrection and tried to steal the presidency himself. And so it's like, if you look at the right, then well over half of those people believe that the election was stolen last time and could be again. And then if you look at the left, they believe that there was a serious attempt to basically commit a coup, right? You have a unprecedented lack of faith in democracy going into this next election, kind of on both sides. And I do think that could animate itself in any number of ways based on how it goes. I do think that the day of January 6, 2025, they're probably going to have like a military compound out of the Capitol. I don't think anyone's going to be storming the United States Capitol again. If I had to guess, it's probably going to look a lot more like Inauguration Day of 2021, when there were 25,000 soldiers in our capital city. But there's 2 months in between, and during that time, there are 50 state capitals. There are boards of election. There are judges. There's all kinds of places that the perceived steal could take place, and that accusation could be levied by either side. And so I certainly would expect that there's any number of ways that kind of conflict could take place. I definitely anticipate trying to be out there and covering it as close up as I can. And God bless America, Republic, if we can keep it.
Yeah, that is all super enlightening. I highly recommend this documentary to all of our viewers. It's called Fight Like Hell. You can, as Ford has so helpfully mentioned, find it for free on YouTube. Before we go, Ford, we have one question that we ask all of our guests on this show. What is one question that you think more people should be asking?
Ooh, that's interesting. I don't know if it's a question, but I think that I wish people would demand of the mainstream media that it not just be spoon feeding them what they already want to hear. Going through the process of making this film, I've watched basically every other January 6th documentary, or documentaries that even tangentially kind of attempt to address it. And basically every film that tries to touch January 6th does one of two things. Either they try to tell the story in a way that really kind of blames and vilifies Trump, like they intentionally make Trump into like an antagonist, or they're films designed to vindicate Trump or justify it, say that the election was stolen, or say that it wasn't so bad, or make one of these points about some kind of infiltration or something. And I feel like that's kind of a symptom of Americans getting very complacent with this idea of like a political binary. You're on Team Newsmax or you're on Team MSNBC, right? And so people are tuning into media that's kind of telling them what they want to hear. And that's a feedback loop. It's not just the corporate media's fault. And I think that it's also not just the population's fault. But so there's a lot of questions that I wish people would be asking, but I think that what they should be demanding in order to get the best answers to all of the questions they should be asking is a media that presents raw footage, right? Kind of like we tried to do with this documentary, and allows them to, trust their audience to form their own opinions about what took place and what's going on.
I know for a fact we're on Team Ford Fischer and Team trusting people to actually be intelligent and able to sift through things without, foisting our narratives onto them, right? People are smart and can make their own decisions for themselves.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for talking to Reason, Ford Fischer.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking Questions. These conversations appear on Reason's YouTube channel and the Just Asking Questions podcast feed every Thursday. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate and review the show.